Awesome. What's up? How's it going? We're here with Neil Bouchard, the author of We Eat Clay and Wear It Too: Personal Stories of the Healing Result of Natural Clay. I really appreciate you coming on. We were talking just barely for a little bit, and it was very fascinating, some of your stories. So I'm excited about this.
Well, and I'm excited to be here. I appreciate this opportunity
Of course.
to share with me or share with you something that's blessed our lives very much. And so, thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, of course. And could you first tell us a little bit about yourself? I'm very curious about how you found this route and you're able to kind of share this with other people. I'm curious about how that happened, but also curious about you and maybe some of your backstory as well.
So, I was born and raised in southern Utah,
Okay.
a little town called Redmond, and that's where I grew up. And then after graduating from college, that's where I went back, and my wife and I raised our 8 children there. The journey as to how we got into this natural clay is an amazing one. It began back in the 1930s, actually, when my grandfather bought a farm just 3 miles north of the town of Redmond.
Where is Redmond?
Redmond is 150 miles south of Salt Lake.
Okay.
It's between Manti and Richfield
Okay.
in southern Utah. And so he bought this farm, and on the side of this farm, there was a deposit of whitish gray material. They call it clay or bentonite clay. And the locals found from the day that Redmond was settled that when this material would get rained on, it would form a gel through which water couldn't pass. It was just a really high quality bentonite clay. So the pioneers would actually use it as roofing material because you could put it on the roof of a shed, a flat top shed, or in a pond, and the pond wouldn't leak. And so once my grandfather had bought this farm with this property or this bentonite clay there, he and then his sons, my dad and uncle, began to sell the clay to line ponds as a sealant. And so that was in the 1930s. In the 1950s, my father and uncle had taken over the family farm, but because of the drought was so bad, there wasn't enough water to irrigate all the acres they had. And so they began looking for other things to do, and they actually went into the salt business because underneath Grandpa's farm, there was a deposit of a natural mineral salt.
Okay.
And so the main product that they sold was salt, but they only sold it for animals because this salt has some 60 trace minerals in it. It gives it a reddish pink color, and these minerals were viewed as impurities, so it wasn't considered fit for human consumption, only for livestock. And the name of the company was Redmond Clay and Salt. Clay that they were selling to line ponds, salt that they were selling for animals. Well, in the early 1970s, the health food people woke up to the fact that the sea salts that were being sold in health food stores were white, refined, chemicalized salts. Nothing like sea salt is supposed to be. Sea salt is supposed to have minerals. But the sea salt that was being sold in health food stores didn't have minerals because they'd been refined out. And so the health food people came to the company wanting the salt as it's a pre-pollution sea salt. And there's a whole story on that we could do. But the thing that caught the eye of the health food stores is the name of the company was Redmond Clay and Salt. And they said, clay? You have clay? And we said, yeah. Have you got a pond that needs to be lined? And they said, well, will your clay do what the French clay does? And we said, what does the French clay do? And they showed us a book entitled Our Earth, Our Cure. It was written by a French homeopath back in the 1950s and then translated into English in 1974 and brought to us in 1975. And when we looked at this book, Carson, we laughed. We laughed for days because this book says, this Raymond Dextrade says that the right kind of clay will respond to the organism and bring the body into balance. It'll do one thing for you, but something else for me. And we're talking dirt. How does dirt respond to an organism? We just laughed. We didn't believe anything.
So prior to that, the use of the clay had nothing to do with any of this stuff. It was
no. The only experience that I knew of the clay being used for people was my father, who was born there in Redmond in 1917. When he was 5 or 6 years old, he got an infection in his hand. And my grandparents went out there to this deposit because there was a local man who was way ahead of his time. His name was Joe Blix. And Joe Blix was actually going out to this deposit and getting this clay, and he would make a mud out of it, and he would pack the wounds of horses and cows with this mud, and they would heal so well that the locals called him Dr. Blix. And he was no more of a doctor than my beagle puppy. But he would use it on wounds. Well, when my father had this infection in his hand with a red streak all the way into the armpit, my grandparents went out to this deposit. Now, Joe Blix didn't own it. Nobody owned it. It was just community property. It was the foothills. But they got some of this clay, made a mud, packed my dad's hand in this mud, wrapped it with a towel, and he went to bed with a red line up his arm. He got up the next morning with no red line.
Wow.
So the locals knew it would pull out infection. It's like putting mud on a bee sting. You know, who hasn't done that? But Joe Blix died, and his work died with him. And I never heard of Joe Blix until the health foods people brought us this book. And then my dad tells me this story of how this clay had pulled the infection out of his hand. Well, these health food stores wanted to know if our clay would work. We wanted to stay out of prison. We wouldn't even sell it to them. We said, it's not for sale, not if you're going to eat it. Because this book says it'll help diarrhea, constipation, heartburn, acid indigestion. The list goes on and on.
Because now we're not just talking external remedy,
No.
it's internal as well.
They wanted to eat it. And we said, no, it's not for sale. Because we could just see, what if somebody dies and we go to prison?
Right.
So I called the Food and Drug, and I said, there's some crazy nuts who want to eat our dirt. What should we be concerned about? And they gave us
Little do you know, you'll later down the road be a crazy nut eating your dirt.
That's right. That's right. But so they gave us a list: lead, mercury, arsenic, beryllium, chromium, streptococcus, staphylococcus, E. coli, everything. We had to test it for everything. The guy at the FDA said it's inert, won't hurt a soul. So with that assurance that it's not going to hurt anybody, when we took some of our deposit. Now, this deposit covers 40 acres, and in this deposit, I mean, there's red clay, green clay, brown clay, yellow clay, gray clay.
Are they all carrying different properties?
We don't know.
Okay.
And up to that point, weren't concerned because it had only been used for ponds. But now we're going to eat it. My uncle looked at our deposits, and there's one white vein off to the side that wasn't really that good for lining ponds. We could tell it. It didn't swell as much. Wasn't as the best for lining ponds, so we had avoided it. But my uncle, who was alive at the time, said, well, if I were going to eat the clay, not that I ever will, I would want to eat this white clay. So it's that white clay, that white vein that we had analyzed, and that became the human gray clay. And we pulverized it, real fine, just a fine white powder, like baby powder, and then put it on the shelf. And then, as our family had medical conditions that conventional medicine couldn't fix, in desperation, we turned to the clay. And it worked. First situation, there was somebody, a gal who was pregnant, and due to the iron and the prenatal vitamins, she was having one bowel movement every week or 10 days. And Dextrate, in his book, he says the way you take clay is you put a teaspoon in a glass of water, and you stir it up. And after you've stirred it up, then you let it set 46 hours for the clay to activate the water, or for the water to take on the minerals and the electronic charge the clay has. So this couple did that, and then Dexter said after you've stirred it up, you can actually set it aside, wait until the sediment drops out, wait until the minerals are in the water, and you can drink the clear water off the top and throw the sediment away, and get the same benefit as drinking the whole muddy mess.
Interesting.
And that couple found that it worked. In 2 or 3 days, her bowels were normal. Daily, easy, gentle, natural bowel movements. We thought, what do you know? Old Dextrate got one thing right. Give him that. But then later, the neighbor of our grandmother, we learned that she had diarrhea so bad it would be down both legs and in her shoes before she could even get out of the church, the post office, or the store to go home. She'd become homebound, locked to a bathroom. Through Grandma, we got her some clay. A week later, that little old lady was in our office, and she hugged me like I was her grandson and thanked me for this product. And I said, Eva, don't thank me. I didn't create this. This is God's creation. We were just blessed to learn about it. And with tears in her eyes, she just sobbed and said, you just don't know how good it is to go out in public again without fear of embarrassment. So constipation, diarrhea, and Detroit said it would help everything in between.
So now you're starting to see some of that at play.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so my uncle, the one who said, not that I'll ever eat it, well, he began to take it for his ulcer that nothing from the drugstore could help. He says it did more for his ulcer than anything. My high school wrestling coach had a hiatal hernia. He said the natural clay did more for it than anything. So little by little, it became, instead of what we would turn to in desperation as a last-ditch effort when conventional medicine couldn't work or wasn't available or didn't work, we would turn to the clay. And so it became went from our first aid kit to our medicine cabinet. And I'm not a wild-eyed radical. I'm not anti-doctor. I don't practice medicine. I don't make any drug claims. We were just blessed with this product, with knowledge of this product.
And it was working.
Yeah. And so, and that's why I'd like to share the story, because I feel sorry for people who don't have it or don't know about it. So that's why we're here.
I love
Carson.
it. Thanks for sharing that. Did you start to see kind of more people find interest as like you were experiencing a lot of those stories with friends and family members? Did it start to make its rounds a little bit?
It did. It's slow, it's word of mouth. But one thing that probably was a big boost was my parents went to Guatemala as senior service missionaries in the 1980s.
Okay.
And of course, they didn't leave home without it. They went to Guatemala with clay. And while they were in Guatemala, they became known as the mission doctors. Any new missionaries from America who were down there getting, climatized to the food and the water, the parasites and the amoebas, they would bring those sick, struggling missionaries to my parents, who would give them a teaspoon of this clay in a glass of water, and it would work. And my father came home with a desire to help the people in Guatemala, because he learned when he was down there that the leading cause of death in children in Guatemala is dysentery. If a child can reach the age of 4 or 5, they would usually go on to adulthood. But the infant loss was just, he felt unacceptable. So when he got home, he actually went to Brigham Young University, who had a large footprint in Guatemala, and gave them money to do a study of the clay as an antidiarrheal. And the results of that study, they published in this book. I guess, I don't know if it's called a white paper, but anyway, this book, it blew the mind of this researcher, because they found that this natural clay, and I should clarify this too, there's as many kinds of clays as there are breeds of dogs. And so to say you've got a clay doesn't tell you a lot. It's like saying you've got a dog. Well, if it's a St. Bernard, you may not want to use it as a lap dog. But on the other hand, if you're going hunting, your little, miniature Chihuahua may not be the appropriate one. And that's the problem with clay is, there's lots of clays out there. Some clays work, some clays don't.
Because it has to contain, what did you say it was, bentonite?
But again, bentonite is
just one of the properties, though.
Yeah, well, bentonite is a general description. So in the clay family, you may have clay in your backyard, in your garden. Clay is just a heavy soil. But inside the clay family, you have specific kinds of clays called bentonites, which have specific properties and specific mineral analyses. But in the bentonite family, you've got sodium bentonites, calcium bentonites, high swelling bentonites, low swelling bentonites. So again, there's just so many variables. And another word, there's a word out there in the community called montmorillonite. Well, the word bentonite is the word that describes this class of this type of mineral that was found in Fort Benton, Wyoming. Montmorillonite is basically the same mineral that was found in Montmoril, France. So bentonites, Montmorillonites are words that can pretty well be interchangeable, and yet inside each of those, there are some subtitle or some subclassifications, again, where some work, some don't. Some have medicinal properties and some don't. And this just, happened to be, one that does. So anyway, BYU did this study, found that this type of bentonite was 99% effective in absorbing the toxins the bacteria emit, the bacteria that cause dysentery. And so without the toxins, because the clay absorbs the toxins, then that bacteria can't proliferate and continue to cause problems. They also found that this natural clay is an ideal electrolyte in terms of its mineral composition: sodium, calcium, potassium, magnesium. It fits the World Health Organization's recommended formula for those minerals, better than any commercial product on the market. This research has said better than Rhysolite, Pedialyte, Gatorade, and a couple of others, with the exception of sucrose. So anyway, we thought that with that research that my dad thought that he could go to Guatemala and help these people. But he found that he couldn't yet. That was an in vitro study, just in a test tube. They needed to do an in vivo study. And so that was the plan, but after 3 years of waiting for the paperwork to go through, this researcher called me and he said, without the money of a drug company, this isn't going to make it to the next desk. And
that's the giant hurdle to getting this to the masses.
He said, you need the money of a drug company. Well, we didn't have the money of a drug company. And so initially at the time, I said to this researcher, you know what? We're just going to donate this to the World Health Organization and we'll let them take it to the world. And he said, you don't know how this works, do you? And I said, apparently not. He said, you could give a semi-load of this to the WHO and it would sit in a warehouse unless you've got millions of dollars to pay for its distribution. I said, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to help people benefit from this, the way our family's benefited? And he said, Neil, word of mouth is probably the only thing you can afford. And so at that point, I wrote a little booklet called We Eat Clay and Wear It Too. And it tells our story.
What year did you write that?
2003.
2003?
Yeah, 20 plus years ago.
Cool.
And then I began teaching classes. I would teach classes to anybody who would be an audience. I taught my clay class to Lions clubs, Rotary clubs, senior citizens, PTAs, any store, any business that wanted to learn about it. I would go and spend an hour or two and teach them how this how this natural clay had blessed our lives. Now, in my classes, I have to be really careful not to tie this natural clay to any company or any product. Because if I say what natural clay does, and if I tie it to a specific company, that is making a drug claim. And so I don't work for any company, I don't represent any company, I just teach natural clay. And then people have to go out and find their own.
Yeah, just the education behind what you've learned throughout your experience with it.
Exactly. And like Dextrate in his book, he says there's all these different kinds of clays, and he said there's really no way, there's no test that really tells you exactly how or which clays work and which clays don't. So he says, find a clay and use it. If it works, stick with it. If it doesn't work, find another clay.
I was going to say, is there a way to test the properties and everything? Like, how would you even go about doing that?
Well, you can test for, like we did initially,
right,
for minerals. Make sure that there's the levels of heavy metals. Make sure there's not any heavy metals that are going to be dangerous. You can also test for microbial activity. Make sure that it's not contaminated, and that's what we did. Again, we tested it for everything. We tested this clay for everything. And the Food and Drug said it's inert, won't hurt a soul. So yeah, if somebody's out there, if they find a clay, unless it's a clay that they're already know that somebody's using to where they're comfortable that it's safe, then yeah, they probably ought to have it tested for heavy metals and microbial activity. But again, that may mean it's safe, but it may not mean it's effective.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
So when you started kind of sharing this, did it ever make its way into like stores?
it's been in stores since day one.
Since day one,
Yeah,
okay. So
yeah, since day one. So
because I guess that's an effective way to go ahead and get your hands on it instead
Yeah.
of figuring out the clay on your
Oh
own,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So people can find a clay in stores, health food stores sell clay. You can go online. There's lots of
Is it
clays.
bentonite? You said bentonite because I've seen like a charcoal like bentonite type thing in health food stores before.
Okay, charcoal
Is that different?
No, yeah.
I mean, it is different, but
Yeah.
is that similar use? I guess I wonder.
There's some similarities because charcoal. They say charcoal absorbs,
Okay.
very absorbing, and so for detoxifying, and clay is also.
So you can find the clay there too. As well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So health food stores are online. The clay. A lot of times people will ask, well, why does the clay work?
Mm-hmm.
There's several theories. One theory is that the clay, or several. This isn't a theory. This is a reason. The clay has a negative electronic charge. Most free radicals, heavy metals, toxins, and poisons have a positive charge. Because opposites attract, the clay can pull out toxins and poisons. It doesn't pull out the beneficial vitamins and nutrients. Interesting story, there was a gal in St. George, Utah, who she had had a case of shingles earlier in her life that had left a lot of nerve damage. And so now in her later years, 70s, 80s, she said she was in pain all day, pain all night, just miserable 24/7. And she felt like she had a lot of heavy metals. And she said, if I could get rid of these heavy metals, I think I'd feel better. And of course, she asked me if the clay would pull out heavy metals. And I said, I can't prove anything, but I've heard it does. Well, she began soaking her feet. She would do a foot soak with clay in the water. And a few days later, she called back as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. She said, I'm sleeping through the night. I'm pain-free. I haven't felt this good for 10 years. Would you send me some literature that I can share with my friends here in the trailer court in St. George? And I said, sure. And so we did. And she called a few days later and said, would you send some literature to my friend in California? And we did. And a few days later it was, would you send some literature to my friend in Oregon? And we did. I mean, this was on a reoccurring basis. Mm-hmm. And one day the receptionist said, Neil, June Rowley's on the phone. And that's this lady. And I picked up the phone and I said, who were you going to send it to today? And she said, what happens if you put clay on plants? And I thought, on plants? Where's that question coming from? And I said, oh, it's good for them. Yeah, it'll mineralize them just like it mineralizes your body. And she started to cry in a sobbing voice over the phone. She said, oh, I should have known better. I should have known better. And I said, June, what's going on? And she said, well, here in St. George, we're told to conserve water. And so I thought, what can I do with this water from soaking my feet? And she said, I came up with a really good idea, I thought, and that was to use it to water my houseplants. And all of my friends, I would tell them, after you soak your feet, then use the water to water your houseplants. She said, I was talking to one of my friends today who's been soaking her feet, like me, and I told her that every plant in my house has died. And my friend said, well, hers aren't dead, but they're looking really sick. So we decided there must be something lethal to plants in that clay. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, there isn't. And now you know what you did, don't you? And she said, yes. All of the toxins
from her
body were in that water. I said, that's right. There's a guy in Hawaii who killed a section of his lawn from the water of soaking his feet after he had soaked his feet. Now you can take the clay and mix it with water, mm-hmm. and you can use it to mineralize your plants. You can use it as a fertilizer.
But all the toxins and poisons that comes out of you goes into the plant.
But once you've soaked your feet, you need to treat that as toxic material, depending on how toxic your body is. Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't have any toxins, then that water, may not be toxic enough. Well, it won't be toxic enough to kill plants, but depending on what it pulls out of you, yes, it can.
Wow. Yeah.
I got a phone call just this month from a gal who in Canada, and she's had lots of health issues. So she's been on lots of supplements, lots of drugs, just, has really struggled her whole life. She had Lyme's disease when she was 30. Now she's in her 60s. So she's really had a journey. But somebody told her about clay. And so she drank a glass of clay water. She said the next day her stool was black. Black.
Everything just getting all the toxins getting pulled
Then
out.
it changed from black to dark green. And then it went from dark green to, she said, like a sick yellow. But it was just, pulling out garbage that
Detoxifying. Right?
had been built up in her body. So
Wow.
it's been an interesting journey. I could tell you stories till noon tomorrow.
Well,
Carson,
I mean, it's
if you've got that much time.
I mean, you wrote a book about it. I mean, and it's been. Have you written more than just this book? Do you have like more resources that you've also written to share?
No, because
So this is the reference then, and then this book has.
yes, because the problem is this book has been out of print for maybe 40 years.
Oh, okay.
And there's another book. I mean, there's lots of books out there, but this has been out of print. And so when I considered writing my book, I thought, well, should I make it big like this one? There's another book out there called The Clay Cures. There's another one called The Healing Power of Clay by Michelle Abashera. So there's lots of books out there, but what I learned was people don't read big books. Back in the day, when I was working, I remember selling this book to people along with clay. And I remember some of those people would come back a few months, even a year later, and they would say, now, what was I supposed to do with that clay I got? And I'd say, I remember you bought the book. Well, I know, but it's a big book. I didn't read it. Just tell me. So when I wrote my book, my purpose was to keep it really small, really simple, so that in 15 or 20 minutes, you could feel comfortable drinking clay in a glass of water or putting mud on an open wound. So
Just
that's
concise, right? To the point.
concise.
There's 8 chapters, it looks like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's 30 pages.
Okay.
But I have them printed several thousand at a time, and I send them out as on request, sometimes one at a time, sometimes 300 at a time.
Can you tell us a little bit about it? I'm seeing there's case histories, there's how to use, it's kind of just the basic rundown of the whole thing.
Right.
But give us a little bit of information about it.
And that's what there's a brief history as far as how we got into the clay. I mean, this isn't something that we went out looking for. This isn't something that we came up with. But I want to tell a little history about it so that people will realize that it's not something I came up with. It was just something that came into
I
our
stumbled upon it.
It was brought into our lives at a very appropriate time. So we tell our stories of how we got into the clay, then a little bit of the historical uses of clay. I mean, Socrates used clay. Every doctor from antiquity, there's records that they used clay. Back in the First World War, soldiers on both sides of the conflict were issued clay as part of their rations.
Interesting.
Yes. And so there's some section on that. And then I talk about how to use the clay, how to prepare it for use internally and externally. Because it's easy once you know how, but this clay is a fine white powder. To take it internally, it's a teaspoon in a glass of water. But this clay in water, it's like flour in water. You put a teaspoon of that in a glass of water, it goes lumpy, sticks to the spoon, sticks to the glass. But the way we did it for the first 30 years is we would just whip it up, break it up as much as the lumps as we could, and then we would just choke it down. And now initially, we would always let it settle out first, to where we were just drinking the clear water. Because Dextrate said that works as well. And drinking the clear water seemed safer. And so that's what we did. But as we found that the clay was beneficial as clear water, then generally we wouldn't wait until it turned clear. We would stir it and then just choke it down, lumps and all. But in the book, it tells how to do that. And then it tells some other things that we learned. And a simple thing is to take that teaspoon of clay and just sprinkle it on the glass of water. Don't stir it. Don't get the spoon wet. Just sprinkle the clay on the water and walk away. And come back a few hours later, even overnight. The sediment will be on the bottom. The minerals will have dissolved into the water, and the clay will have taken on, or the water will have taken on the electronic charge of the clay. And then, at that point, you can stir it, and it'll stir as smooth as a glass of milk with no lumps. And if you don't mind drinking the murky water, you can drink it right then, and you can't even detect any sediment going through your teeth. So that, in the book, it tells things like that. It also talks about how to use the clay externally. Now, to use the clay externally, you want a gel about like mayonnaise or mustard. You want a gel.
So this is just this powder mixed with water?
That's all it is.
Okay.
Yep. And the certain recipe, basically it's 3-to-1, 3 parts water, 1 part clay.
Okay.
But you want a gel like that.
Yeah.
And you want it to be thick enough to where when you put it on a wound, it doesn't drip. But you want it to be thin enough.
A paste almost.
Yeah, mayonnaise.
Okay.
Mayonnaise is the perfect consistency. You want it to be smooth, thin enough to where when you put on a wound, you don't have to mold it or press it to the flesh. The last thing, Carson, you want is a child already in pain, and here dad or mom or grandma is shoving on his owie, trying to, spread out this thick, heavy paste. So mayonnaise, mustard is the perfect consistency. So the book tells, how to do that.
Instruction a little bit on that.
Yeah, and it tells the importance of having it on hand. Dextrate in his book, he had some information in there that's important. Clay, because of this electronic charge, you don't want it in contact with metal. Metal will destroy that electronic charge or affect it in a negative way. So you can't use metal. And he also said, avoid plastic. Use glass where practical. So in our kitchen cupboard, we have a quart mason jar with a plastic lid. And it's in the kitchen cupboard. If one of our kids, used to be kids, now it's grandkids, takes a nosedive in the driveway, comes up all skinned and bloody, we just run in the house and scoop it out of that quart mason jar and put it wherever it needs to be. If someone gets into the wasps or the stinging nettle, poison ivy, you run in the house and you scoop it out and put it on those wounds. When that jar in our house gets less than half full, down to like a third full, I don't even wash it out. I just add more clay and more water at that recipe, shake it back up, put it back in the cupboard. In my vehicles, I don't want a glass bottle rolling around. So in my vehicles, I actually keep one of these, plastic tube, and it'll roll around through the heat of summer, through the freezing of winter, 365 days a year. But
Just on hand.
if we're on a camping trip, we're in the mountains, we're somewhere, and somebody gets cut, burned, bruised, scraped, stinging nettle, we run to the vehicle, it's under the seat or in the trunk. And the book tells, how to prepare it and keep it on hand for that. And then in the middle of the book, there's a list of, you can look at your own. There's a list of a lot of the things that we've used the clay for, both internal and external. And you can see there's probably 20 different items. And I could tell you stories about every one of those.
Case studies for all of these. I mean, before we started this conversation, you were showing us those pictures with they were pretty intense cuts and injuries that, you would probably immediately, like you were saying, go to the hospital, right? But this guy used this, and over months' time, it's perfect. It's the week to week photos that you showed us. You could definitely see how it improved. So.
Right. And if there's an injury, and if there's hospital is available, doctor available, sure, go to the hospital, go to the doctor if that's where you need to be. Now, if it's minor, like you know, road rash from, you know, falling on the in the driveway, you know, you probably don't need to go to the doctor for that. You know, bee stings, wasp, you
Right.
probably don't need to go to the doctor for that. So yeah, use this. Now, if it's serious, life-threatening, certainly go. There's a friend of our family's. He had third-degree burns. Well, second and third-degree burns. He had gasoline splashed on him down both legs and one arm, and then it ignited. So he spent a week in the burn center, and we're grateful for hospitals. We're grateful for burn centers. And if it's life-threatening, get to the hospital. So he spent a week in the burn center on morphine as they did this daily debriding to treating these burns. But because he was a 26-year-old man, you know, and this was 20 years ago with no insurance, after a week it was no longer life-threatening. And so they asked him to leave. They said, you need to find a cheaper place to recuperate. So he went to southern Utah, Circleville, where his parents lived. And his mother's job twice a day was to debride him without morphine, because they wouldn't let him take morphine home from the hospital. So her job was to debride him twice a day. He was on the 3 strongest pain meds available, and it wasn't even touching the pain. After a week of that, they learned of the clay, and they began using clay instead of the gauze and Silvadene. And they would just put heavy layer of clay on his burns, wrap him with plastic wrap. His pain level, they said, went down 75% in the first 24 hours.
Wow, that's so impressive.
Yes. Within 3 days, his discomfort was not the pain of the burn, but the itch of the healing. He was never debrided again, never wore the compression socks again. They changed the clay every day for a month. You cannot see a scar on him today.
Wow.
Avoided skin grafts and all that went with it. Again, I'm not anti-doctor. If you've got that life-threatening burns, get to a burn center. But once it's not life-threatening, what we have seen is that the clay may be a better way to go.
Natural remedy that just exists and is ready to go.
There's a fellow, I taught a clay class in American Fork earlier this year. And in that class, my class, I show how to mix the clay for drinking and how to mix it for topical applications. And one of the things I said was, what a doctor had told me years ago was that there's 2 keys to healing a wound. One is prevent infection, and the other is to keep it moist. And the clay does that. It prevents infection because every time you change it, every time you change that clay, every time you take that clay off, the infection goes with it. And it keeps it moist. So prevent infection, keep it moist is the key to healing a wound. And so I taught a class in March in American Fork, mentioned that, and in just a month later, there was a fellow who had been in the class who he finally went to the doctor. He had a wound, a sore on the top of his head he'd had for 2 years, 2 years that wouldn't heal. And so finally, he went in and had it biopsied, and it was cancerous. And so they removed it, but that left a 2.5 by 3 inch open wound on the top of his head. And he was given 2 choices. They said, we can do a skin graft to, close this 2.5 inch hole. But to do that, we have to take skin from another part of the head. We can't take it from other parts of the body. So he knew now he's dealing with 2 wounds, where the skin graft came from, plus the original. Right. The doctor said, but another option is to just keep it moist and let it heal by itself as long as you keep it moist. And they said there's a product called hydrogel that will do that. Well, he said he went home and he put the hydrogel on, and he said it was like pouring alcohol or gasoline in an open wound. So he said, I only did it once. And he said, I remember in your class you said that the clay will help keep wounds moist. So he said, I made a mud, had the mud, put that mud on there. He said it felt like I was putting a cool, wet washcloth on my head. And then he said, and I just, put a big pad of gauze on that. And he said, from that point on, there was no pain. He said, I've changed it every day. And he's actually sent me, he created a Dropbox and has put all these pictures in it. So I've got pictures from day one when it was just an open, bloody, raw
hole
to, what it's like now, 30 days later. And that 2.5, 3-inch hole has just grown in. There's all this new pink, healthy flesh around it, and that hole is just shrinking right in.
Wow.
Just amazing. So that's why I do these classes. That's why I wrote the book, is just to help people benefit the way we were benefited.
Mm-hmm. Share the message. That's very cool.
And so back to the book, that's what it talks of after the list of the things we've used it for. Then there's the...
Got like spider bites, sprains, infections, eczema, cuts, detox, rash, bruises, arthritis. Like there's so many,
Yes. And arthritis is on both sides. Because for many years, we would... first stories we heard about the clay helping arthritis. And again, these are stories that people bring to us.
Right.
The stories we were hearing was how they would pack arthritic joints in it, elbows, knees. They would pack it in the mud and then wrap it to cover it, cover it with either plastic or fabric, and how it would help.
Now, is this just a treatment, or is this also preventative too? Like, is this like a daily thing, or is this something that you have an ailment that you're treating, and then once it's kind of, like once he's kind of his skin's back on that hole, and then it's kind of healed up? Is this something that is also preventative, like a daily? You mix this in water daily, like what? How do you use it like that?
Well, you're talking two things. You're talking external and internal. External, if you got a wound, externally, you put it on externally until the wound's healed. Yeah. So I'm sure once this guy's head, I'm guessing within another month, it's just going to be totally healed over.
And then he won't need to use
He'll
it.
He'll never do it again. Same thing with rashes, spider bites, infections. A fun one. Have a guy there in Richfield got a big wooden sliver up underneath his fingernail. Ooh. And they tried with tweezers to pull it out. Couldn't. So they got a needle, began digging under this guy's fingernail with a needle, trying to hook the sliver enough to pull it out to get tweezers on it. Finally, this 20-year-old kid he's no wimp. He said, hey, bag this. He said, I can live with that sliver, but I can't live with you digging with that needle. So his grandma took a glob of clay, put a big glob, she said about like a small hen's egg, over his finger, and then wrapped it with a handkerchief. He said his pain level dropped from a 10 to a 2 within minutes. He went to bed with that handkerchief on his hand. The next morning, he takes the handkerchief off. The clay came off, stuck to the handkerchief, and in the clay was the sliver.
Awesome.
There was another family who used that similarly, but as they took the clay off, the handkerchief and the clay off, the sliver wasn't in the clay; it was hanging loose, and they just pulled it off. So that's a one-time application. Now internally, some people take the clay on an as-needed basis, and some do it every day as a detox.
So you could totally do that like supplemental.
Yeah. For the first 30 years, Carson, I took it on an as-needed basis. Probably not more than 2 or 3 times a year. If I got food poisoning, if I felt some heartburn, if I felt any intestinal discomfort, I would use it. But I was blessed with a really good digestive system. I was very blessed. So 3 or 4 times a year is probably all I used it for the first 30 years. But then I would hear people who would tell me that they were taking it every day and all the benefits that they saw. And so sometimes I would think, maybe I ought to take it more often. So then I would take it, every day for a week or a month. Then I'd get out of the habit because I didn't have any issues to go away. But a few years ago, I did begin to take it daily because I've donated blood my whole adult life, but only usually twice a year because in southern Utah, that's as often as the bloodmobile would, come to our hometown. But I thought, you know what? I ought to donate more often because there's a shortage of blood and I have plenty. I don't have the right type, but they want it. If it's red, they want it. So I began donating blood every 2 months, which is what you can do. On the third attempt, they turned me down because of low iron. And I thought, low iron? I've never had low iron. And the phlebotomist said, well, men who donate more than 3 or 4 times a year will run into low iron just like a menstruating woman. And I said, well, what can I do to get it up? Because I said, ironically, there's another blood drive coming to my hometown in 30 days. And she said, well, eating a lot of red meat, might help. And I thought, I don't want to eat any more red meat than I'm eating now. And then I talked to a doctor who said, well, I can give you a prescription that'll bring your iron up, but that usually takes, a couple of months. And then I reflected on the number of women who had come up to me at the end of my clay classes and had told me how taking clay every day had brought up their iron. One lady was under a doctor's care, and her iron just wouldn't come up to a healthy level. And she began drinking clay every day, and it came up. So I drank clay every day for the next 30 days, and 30 days later, I donated blood. And I kept doing it. I kept drinking a teaspoon of clay in a glass of water every day, just as faithful as the sun coming up over the mountain in the morning. I drank a glass of clay water.
Mm-hmm.
2 months later, I donated blood. 2 months later, I donated blood. 2 months later, I donated blood. I donated blood every 2 months for the next year and a half. My iron never went low again.
That's impressive.
So, yeah. Currently, I don't do it every day. I probably do it, 4 or 5 times a week. But
you can. Yeah.
I can. Can you overdose on clay? You bet. Yeah, just like vitamin C. If you take too much vitamin C, what happens?
Right.
Diarrhea. That's your body's way of telling you, hey, you've overdosed. Excess. The clay it tells you, but it's not diarrhea. It's constipation. Taking too much clay, especially if you're not drinking enough water, can cause constipation. Right. Which is ironic because I know people who've been so constipated.
And the clay helps.
And it helps.
Mm-hmm.
We had a grandson when he was 2 months old. His mother was no longer able to nurse him. And so the doctors were actually having them shove suppositories up his little rectum. And when we heard that, we said, hey, not on our grandkids, you don't. And so his parents mixed up clay, like as if they were going to drink it, used the water off the top to mix the formula. And as soon as he got formula made with the clay water, his little bowels kicked in, and he filled diapers. He filled diapers every day.
There you go. Do you see a specific, like with all the stories and when you're teaching and having those classes and stuff like that, do you have people come with like a reoccurring ailment a lot of the times for the use at all? Like where that people are like, is it mainly like diarrhea or is it just all over the board? Because the list is so huge, but I'm wondering if there's like you know what I'm trying to say? Like if there's some sort of consistent like thing that people come and use clay for more than others. Because there's just looks like the list is just massive. So
it is. I mean, and some things, and the clay it's not a silver bullet,
right?
But
no, it could just be added to your,
right. It's another quiver or it's another arrow in the quiver,
right?
But the worst thing that we've seen happen with clay is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
In 45 years, we've never seen an allergic reaction, never seen a negative side effect. Unless it's constipation from overdosing. But if you've got diarrhea, constipation is not a side effect. It's a desired result, or at least a controlled bowels. So just about any intestinal discomfort, we have seen it help. Externally, we've never seen an infection that it hasn't helped. But it's just all over the board.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and some chronic problems go away. Gluten. There was a gal, friend of ours. She was so intolerant to gluten. If she walked into a room like this where flour had been sifted or wheat had been ground, just that dust in the air would put her in bed for days. If she touched flour, trying to make cookies or bread for her children. Just touching the flour, she would be in bed for days. Just so sensitive. Her normal weight was around 130, 35 pounds. She went down to less than 100 pounds. Her husband described her as a skeleton with skin. And she was finally talked into trying clay because, conventional medicine never had worked for her. And she was hesitant to try the clay because she said, I don't eat dirt. But then she said, there's no way that a $10 bottle of dirt is going to do what tens of thousands of dollars has failed to do. But when life was so desperate, she finally tried the clay. And it's interesting, she drank clay every day for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, she got as sick as if she had eaten a loaf of bread. She said to her husband, throw out the clay. Now I'm allergic to it. He knew what was going on, thankfully. He said, no. He said, that clay is pulling out of your tissues into your bloodstream the toxins, the irritants that have been stuffed away that have been causing this problem. He said this would be what you'd call a healing cleanse, a healing crisis. So he begged her to keep doing the clay. So she did every day. And she had a rough 2 months. But after that, then her life really got better. And she was better most of the time for another couple months. And after those 4 months, perfect health. Every day. Felt fantastic. She was ready to go back to gluten, but her husband had heard that for somebody who's as bad as she is, or was, that it can take up to a year to detoxify. So he begged her, no, Christy, not yet.
Keep detoxing.
Keep doing it. So after a year, after 365 glasses of clay water had gone down her throat, it was the week before Thanksgiving, and she ate a roll to see what would happen. And the next day she still felt good. So for Thanksgiving that year, for the first time in 4 years, she ate rolls and pie.
Wow, there you go.
And the next morning, she said, her husband said, how do you feel? And she said, like another piece of pie. Let's have some for breakfast. She went back to eating bread, pies, cakes, donuts, cookies. Nothing made her sick. Her weight went back up, which...
And she was consistently still having the clay.
Yeah, at that point, she was still doing the clay. And to hear her tell the story is fun, because she said, when I was so sick, so much of the time, she said, when I could take my little teenage daughters for shopping for school clothes, she said, I could fit in those size 1 dresses better than they could. And she said, that was so fun. And she says, now I'm a size 4. But her husband, who was standing there listening, he said, oh, but honey, being married to this size 4 female is so much more fun than being married to that size 1 fence post. So, but now that the problem was gone away, she quit doing the clay at some point, and at some point the symptoms started to come back. So she immediately went back to the clay. Symptoms were immediately gone. So from that point on, she was just drinking the clay a couple of times a week. And she said by drinking the clay a couple of times a week, she was able to eat the bread, pies, cakes, donuts in moderation.
Manage
in moderation.
Okay.
And her weight's back to this 130, 35 pounds.
Wow.
So yeah, it's an individual basis. It's more of an art than a science. Some people have said that drinking the clay at night is the best. Other people have said in the morning it's the best. It's just for them. Find out what works for you.
Explore.
So, some people like just drinking the clear water off the top. Other people say, I crave the whole sediment.
Now, in some of the classes that you do, I guess, how often do you do the courses? That you said that you do some kind of lectures?
Well, I do anytime I can get an audience.
Okay. So when you set them up and you're able to find people to...
Yeah, before COVID shut the world down, I was probably teaching in maybe a dozen classes a year. And then when the COVID shut the world down in March of 2020, there was a gal who had filmed me teaching a class the week before the world shut down. And so she took what she had filmed and she put it online as a class that people could register for. Had a $49 fee on it, which gave them access to the class for the next 2 years. And I thought, great, I won't need to teach classes anymore, and we'll reach a far bigger audience than just people who have to come and see me. But not enough people signed up because, the attendance at my clay classes is similar to the attendance that Noah had at his ark building classes in biblical times. Because most people aren't interested in the solution to the crisis until they're in the crisis. So I thought the class online was a great idea, but it just didn't fly. There wasn't enough money to keep it going. So that's now been discontinued, but we're looking at putting it on YouTube.
Cool.
It's not there yet, but I'm hoping within a month it'll be on YouTube.
Yeah, and I'm sure, like, for a lot of people, hearing, the healing results of natural clay, they'd be like, wait, what? I haven't heard of that before, right? And so it's kind of cool to be able to, like, share that in a more extensive way, right?
Exactly. So
Break it down for people.
But I'll still teach classes, wherever. I mean, I've gone to Pennsylvania, gone to Nevada. I was in North Carolina this spring. So
For the classes. Okay. Very cool.
So, but again, there's no economics in it because I don't sell clay. I don't sell clay. I don't represent any company, and so for me, it's what I can find or afford to do. The book, I have the book printed in runs of 3,000 or 4,000, and getting ready to now do another because I've gone through 3,000 in the last year.
So this is just your message, really, because you've seen it help so many people that you just want to share it. It's not really anything but outside of that.
No, I feel sorry, and for people who don't have it. But I realize too, Carson, I'm not getting any younger. At some point, I'm not going to be able to teach classes. At some point, this message is going to go away, unless I can get the word out there enough to where, word of mouth can reach other people, and
Right.
and that's important that they do. I told the story about the sliver under the fingernail. There was a lady who came to one of my classes, and the next week she told me that the day after she got home from my class, her neighbor came across the street and said, "My little child has got a sliver under the fingernail. How do you get that out?" Because she had been in my class earlier, just days before. She said, "Oh, I know how." So that's the importance of things. Another is, case in point, there was a family up in Logan who was letting off fireworks, and here, I tell people don't let off fireworks until you've got the clay. This guy was letting off fireworks, and the firework malfunctioned, went in the air, flew over, dropped on the porch next to his 10-month-old son, grandson, who was sitting there in a diaper and a T-shirt. And this rocket, fell next to his leg, and the flame was shooting into his leg. So being a 10-month-old, he did what he thought, what a 10-month-old would do. He grabbed what was hurting him. He grabbed the end of the rocket. We're talking powder that's shooting out of that rocket. They say at 1,100 degrees. He grabbed the end of that. So now he's got powder burns on his leg and his hand. And he, of course, he's screaming. Grandpa ran over there, kicked the firework off from the porch, grabbed his grandson, was running into the house when the grandma and the parents came running out and told him what happened. They ran him in the house. They put him in a sink with water, trying to, help this little kid who's just screaming in pain. And everybody's going crazy except Grandma. She goes into her bedroom, kneels down, and asks Heavenly Father for guidance. What do I do for the little grandson? And to her mind came the idea, the words came, "Get Dana's clay." Dana was her neighbor across the street, my niece. So they ran across the street, got Dana's clay. Within 15 minutes, this little guy has quit crying. And it's an amazing story. I don't know that we've got time for the details, but long story short, that little boy slept through the night. We're talking powder burns. Slept through the night, never cried again, and I saw that little boy 30 days later. You couldn't tell which hand had been burnt, and unless you caught the light just right on the leg, you couldn't even see the slight discoloration,
It's all healed up.
all healed up.
Hmm.
So, yeah, people who know about it need to tell others. I wish there were an economic way to put it out there, but no company is going to spend millions of dollars to prove what it can do because they can't patent it.
Right.
You can't patent something that's out there, common knowledge, that anybody else can sell without spending any money.
Hmm.
So yes, I appreciate this opportunity to share this in this podcast.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And I appreciate all the case studies and all the education behind it because, like it's a testament, I guess, to, being open to realizing that there's so many ways to be healthy or so many ways to treat different things. It's not just, there's not just one answer across the board for every human being out there. There's like so many different things that we can learn about and stay open to. So I appreciate you teaching us about this today.
Well, appreciate that. And again, it's more of an art than a science.
Right.
It's try what works for you. A lot of times people will come to me and they'll ask, well, will the clay help this? Some issue I've never even heard of, or will the clay help that? Oftentimes I tell people, if I had some issue that I was wondering about, I would do three things. I would drink the clay. Even if it's an external issue, I would drink the clay, because we've found many times external issues are really internal issues that are coming out. So I would always drink the clay if I had an issue. The other is I would put it on topically. If you got a rash, a pain, a bruise, a swelling, any place you've got, if you can think of where to put it on topically, put it on topically. And the other is I would either soak my feet or do a full body clay bath, because your skin is your largest organ of elimination, and the clay simply helps the skin eliminate those toxins. So
That's awesome.
there are some mistakes you can make with the clay. Mistake number one is not having it on hand, or knowing how to use it, or forgetting to use it once you've got it on hand. A big mistake is if you put it on a burn and let it dry. On a burn, you keep it moist. That's why you cover it with plastic wrap or a wet towel. There was a gal in Phoenix who put it on a sunburn. It's great for sunburns. It's fantastic. She loved it. It was cool, soothing. But then she made the mistake of letting it dry.
And that's not so soothing after that.
No. And then the next mistake, instead of getting in the shower and showering it off, she picked it off. I'm sure some of the hide came with it. So you never let it dry on a burn. Now, on an infection, like my dad's arm with the infection infection in the hand with the red line up the armpit, you want it to dry. You want it to dry from mayonnaise consistency to be like Play-Doh consistency, because in that drying, that's when it really draws and stimulates the circulation. So a mistake is, on a wound, not letting it dry.
Using it the right way for specific.
Right. So,
Yeah.
and the internet can be a good source. The problem with the internet, there's no truth filter. So there's some information, on the internet that's mildly wrong, and some is just blatantly wrong. Years ago, a guy wrote a book, and he said for a clay bath, now for a clay bath, I use a 3/4 of a cup to a cup. This guy wrote a book, and in his book, he suggested using 4 pounds of clay. That's crazy.
4 pounds of
4
clay.
pounds of clay in a bathtub. That's crazy, because you can't let that go down the drain. If you use a cup like I do, you just let it go down the drain. We put a cup of clay down our drain for years. My boys who used to play out in the mud probably put more dirt down our drain than that. But if you're using 4 pounds like that guy recommended, no, you have to get out of the tub. You have to get a siphon, wait until the clay settles out, get a siphon the water off, and then scoop that mud out of the tub. So there's some wrong information out there.
That's good to know. Have you connected with any of the other, you mentioned a few other authors that have written resource books about this as well. Have you networked with them or connected with them at all?
No.
Curious.
The guy who Raymond Dexter, he was dead before
Right.
we even knew he was of him. There is one, Jason R. Eaton. Yeah, Jason R. Eaton. In fact, that name's here on the back of the book. He wrote a book called Upon a Clay Tablet
Oh, yeah, right
by
here.
Jason R. Eaton.
So it says, I suggest the following books: Upon a Clay Tablet, that's his.
Uh-huh.
The Healing Power of Clay by Michael
Abashara. Uh-huh. And that
Earth
one,
Cures.
yeah. And so those bottom two are no longer in print.
Gotcha.
Upon a Clay Tablet, I believe, still is, and Eaton's, in my opinion, was the best unbiased book.
Okay.
There's some books out there that are trying to sell a specific kind of clay. Years ago, there was a famous lady who she had a deposit of a calcium bentonite. And so her big song and dance was calcium bentonite. If it's not calcium bentonite, it's no good. Well, that's because she owned a calcium bentonite deposit. So to sell her
That makes
product.
sense.
So
Right.
yeah, there can be some bias out there.
Just be aware of that. Where can people find like your book, or do you have a website that people can reference to kind of find out more information about kind of your book and other things?
The website that had the class in the book is currently down.
Okay.
My email, you'll laugh, is weeatclay@gmail.
That's perfect. Fitting.
Yeah, weeatclay. And so people will email me or call.
So is that okay to leave here if
Oh,
they're
yeah.
interested in the book
Yeah.
or any of that stuff?
Yeah,
Okay.
weeatclay@gmail.com.
Okay.
And like I say, I mail them out one at a time. I mail them out 300 at a time. And people they'll call, I'll ask. I get several phone calls a week from people just sometimes either telling me the wonders of clay, like the guy with the wound, or other people who are asking, how do I use it for this? How do I use it for that? And so as long as I can, I'm glad to answer questions and help. Again, if there were some way to put an economic driver behind it,
Right.
that would be,
That's the biggest hurdle.
yeah, that's the biggest hurdle. Because again, I could tell you stories till noon tomorrow, and life-changing, life-threatening stories. There was a guy in Wisconsin who stepped on a nail out in his barnyard, and of course, nail puncture wounds from nails, rusty old nails out in barnyards are serious. And so they treated it, hoping it wouldn't develop into tetanus. Well, it went into tetanus and developed into lockjaw. This guy spent 6 weeks in a hospital dealing with this lockjaw, and finally, it had healed over, and they felt like the lockjaw had been resolved, and it was healed over. So he left the hospital, but as soon as he got out of the hospital, he called his friend and he said, "This isn't healed. It couldn't hurt this bad. It's excruciating." So he knew it wasn't healed, but he wanted to get out of the hospital. He called his friend. His friend went over there and they made a poultice of the clay, packed it, wrapped it with a towel. He said the wound opened back up. It had been all healed over. It opened back up, and then he said, "You wouldn't believe all the garbage, all the crud that the clay sucked out of that."
So when you put the clay on, it opened up the wound again?
Within 24 hours.
Oh, wow.
Not immediately.
Yeah.
Uh,
But as it was working.
As it was working, the wound opened back up, and he said you wouldn't believe all the garbage that the clay sucked out of that wound, including a piece of black rubber
Oh, wow.
that had been in that foot for 6 weeks. And
Yikes.
the clay opened the wound up, sucked all that infection out, and the black rubber out, and then it healed. I have a friend who she broke her leg years ago in a car accident, and they put a rod in her leg, and they said, if the rod doesn't cause problems, you'll be buried with this rod. Well, at some point it did begin to cause problems, and so they took the rod out, and the wound, the hole where they took the rod out, just never would heal. Home Health came to her house twice a week for 9 months, dealing with this wound that just wouldn't heal. And one day, after home health had gone, her husband suggested they pack it in clay. So they packed it in clay, and within a few days, as they were taking they changed it every day. You know, a mistake you can make is putting clay on a wound and leaving it there too long, because that clay will, if it can suck out infection, it's going to. Well, you need to change that. If you don't change that clay, that infection has nowhere to go. So, and when you change the clay, if it's stinky, that means you need to change it more often. It's just like the dishcloth that, you know, a woman will use to wipe her kitchen counter. If you don't change a dishcloth often enough, they can get really rank. That doesn't mean you shouldn't wash off your countertop. That just means you should change the dishcloth more often. And the same with clay on a wound. But anyway, changing this clay every day, within a few days, as they took the clay off, there was some stringy stuff attached to the clay. And they got a piece of tweezers and began pulling at this stringy stuff, and they pulled a piece of gauze out of her leg.
Oh, wow. So that was embedded in her leg.
Yes, it had been there either since the rod was put in or when the rod was taken out. But it had been there for at least 9 months, because, like I say, home health had been coming to her house twice a week for 9 months. So it had been in there at least 9 months. But once the clay was out, once the clay had sucked the gauze out,
Right.
then it healed over
Okay.
just fine.
Wow. That's impressive. Well, these stories have been really fascinating. I appreciate all the information and just the success stories to hear it. There's so many, so I really appreciate it. And again, if anyone wants to connect, or if they're interested in the book, is that cool if they go ahead and access that email, weeatclay@gmail.com?
You bet. Be glad
and then
to.
if you have just please connect and reach out if that's something that sounds interesting to you. This has been fascinating, and appreciate your time. This has been really fun.
Yeah. And it's been fun for me.
Good.
I tell people, asking me to talk about natural clay is like asking an old person to talk about their grandchildren. But it's been meaningful for me to see it bless lives, and I'd like to see it help others. And if there's someone who has got millions of dollars, or someone who can see how to help more people, great. I don't want to. It's not my product. I just would like to see.
And it is word of mouth, and so it's any resources like this helps conversation, if there's events or any of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Word of mouth.
Yep. I'll teach clay classes wherever.
That's wonderful.
I'm invited, as long as somehow economically,
right,
we can make it work.
For sure. Well, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Oh, Carson, thank you for the time.
It's been cool. So we eat clay and wear it too. Personal stories of healing results of natural clay. So go ahead and reach out if that sounds like something that's interesting to you. And thanks again.
Thank you.